The moment someone reaches for your property with borrowed authority, they stop testing your patience and start revealing their own mistakes. The first thing I noticed that Tuesday morning was not the sound of tires crunching over my gravel driveway. It was the metallic rattle of the old brass chain hanging across my family gate, moving gently in the cool Texas breeze exactly the way it had every morning since my grandfather installed it more than 50 years ago. The smell of cedar drifted from the ranch house behind me while fresh coffee warmed my hands. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the split-rail fence, completely unaware that the quiet routine of another sunrise was about to disappear. My name is Nathan Brooks, and that weathered green gate at the end of my driveway had protected 3 generations of my family long before Willow Creek Estates existed on the neighboring land. It was never just a gate. It marked the line between private property and everyone else's opinion. I had learned from my father that boundaries are not measured by fences alone. They are measured by whether you have the courage to defend them without losing your composure. At exactly 8:17, a white sport utility vehicle stopped outside the entrance. Diane Whitmore stepped out wearing a navy blazer that looked more suited for a courtroom than a neighborhood street. A thick folder rested beneath her arm, and the confident smile on her face suggested she had already decided how this conversation would end. Seconds later, another vehicle arrived. A marked county patrol vehicle rolled in behind hers. Deputy Scott Whitmore climbed out, adjusted his duty belt, and walked toward the gate with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed his uniform answered questions before anyone asked them. Diane tapped the chain with one finger before looking directly at me. "Good morning, Nathan. We are here to resolve the gate access issue once and for all." I took another sip of coffee before answering. "Good morning. I was not aware there was an issue." She smiled politely, but the smile never reached her eyes. "The Homeowners Association has determined that emergency access requires one working key to this gate. We are requesting immediate compliance." I looked at the brass padlock hanging from the chain. Its worn surface reflected the morning sunlight, just enough to remind me how many years it had faithfully done its job. Then I looked back at Diane. "Your neighborhood begins on the other side of the fence. My property begins here." Scott stepped forward, resting one hand casually near his belt. "Sir, this is a reasonable request that benefits the entire community." I noticed he chose the word request instead of order. That difference mattered more than either of them realized. Diane opened the folder and removed several neatly printed documents covered with official-looking language, highlighted paragraphs, and multiple signatures from the HOA board. She held them toward me as though the paper itself carried unquestionable authority. I accepted the documents, carefully reading every page without rushing. Years ago, my father taught me another lesson. The fastest way to expose bad paperwork is to let the people who wrote it believe you are impressed. When I finished reading, I folded the papers neatly and handed them back. "I appreciate the effort," I said calmly. "The answer is still no." Diane's expression tightened for the first time. "Nathan, refusing to cooperate could create unnecessary consequences." I smiled politely because that sentence sounded strangely familiar. I had heard versions of it many times before from people who believed confidence could replace legal authority. Scott glanced toward the gate again before placing his hand lightly against the weathered steel. He never crossed onto my property. He simply stood there, looking at the lock as though he already imagined it belonged to someone else. What neither of them understood was that every second of this conversation, every word they spoke, every movement they made, and every assumption they carried was quietly becoming part of a story they believed they controlled. They thought they had come to take my gate key. They never realized they had just stepped into an investigation that had started long before either of them arrived. The next morning began with the smell of fresh rain settling into the cedar trees that lined my driveway. Tiny drops still clung to the weathered green gate, reflecting the first light of sunrise as birds called from the oak branches overhead. I stood on my porch with another cup of coffee, watching the mist slowly lift from the pasture while my horses wandered toward the water trough without a care in the world. If someone had driven past the ranch at that moment, they would have seen nothing more than another peaceful morning in rural Texas. They certainly would not have guessed that the first move in a much larger game had already been made. By 9 o'clock, my mailbox contained another envelope from the Homeowners Association. The certified sticker stood out against the white paper like a warning someone desperately wanted me to notice. I carried it inside, placed it on my dining room table, and opened it with the same letter opener my father had used for years. The language sounded stronger this time. The board claimed my refusal to provide a gate key created unnecessary risk for the community. They requested immediate cooperation before additional administrative action became necessary. It was carefully written to sound official without actually creating any legal obligation. That distinction mattered more than most people understood. I scanned every page into my computer before filing the original inside a binder labeled by date and time. One shelf in my office already held dozens of identical binders, each containing letters, notices, property surveys, and correspondence that stretched back months. Every document had its place. Every conversation had a matching record. My father always believed that organized facts eventually become their own strongest argument. Around lunchtime, my security monitor chimed softly. Diane had returned, but this time she was alone. She stood outside the gate with a tablet in one hand and several printed neighborhood maps tucked beneath her arm. I walked down the gravel driveway at an unhurried pace until we faced one another again with the steel gate between us. "Nathan," she said pleasantly, "I thought perhaps we could discuss this without making it more complicated." I smiled politely. "It already seems fairly complicated." She laughed softly as though we shared the same joke. "The board is only trying to protect everyone. Emergency responders cannot lose valuable minutes if something happens." I nodded. "Emergency responders already have lawful procedures for private property." Her smile faded slightly. "You keep focusing on ownership instead of cooperation." "Those two ideas are not opposites," I answered. She glanced toward the cameras mounted beneath the gate canopy before quickly looking away. "You really record everything?" "Everything that happens on my property." She folded the maps and slipped them back beneath her arm. "Some people in the neighborhood think you are hiding something." I looked across the pasture where sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the old barn roof with a warm golden glow. People usually believe whatever story reaches them first. Diane held my gaze for a long moment before turning toward her vehicle. "The board will not simply forget about this." "Neither will I," I replied calmly. She drove away without another word, but less than an hour later my phone began filling with neighborhood message board notifications. Someone had posted that I refused to cooperate with community safety. Another claimed I believed I was above the rules. A third suggested the county might become involved if I continued resisting reasonable requests. I read every comment without responding to a single one. Arguments disappear almost as quickly as they begin. Records last much longer. Before sunset, I saved screenshots of every public post, noting the exact timestamps beside each file. The next afternoon, my next-door neighbor, Carl Henderson, pulled into my driveway without calling first. Carl and I had shared fence repairs, barbecue weekends, and more than a few fishing trips over the years. If anyone understood where my property ended and the subdivision began, it was him. He removed his cap slowly and avoided looking me in the eye. "Nathan," Diane asked me to sign a statement. "What kind of statement?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Just saying you've refused emergency access, that you've become a safety concern." I nodded without saying anything. I didn't sign it. I finally looked at him. "Why not?" He sighed and pointed toward my gate. "Because I was standing right here the day firefighters came for your barn 5 years ago. They never asked for a key." That conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but it reminded me of something important. Rumors recruit people. Truth asks them to remember. As the evening breeze gently rattled the brass chain hanging across my gate, I realized Diane believed she was shaping public opinion. She never imagined that every letter she mailed, every statement she published, and every visit she made was quietly becoming another carefully preserved piece of evidence in a story that was only beginning to unfold. Friday evening brought the first community meeting since Diane began her campaign, and by the time I pulled into the Willow Creek Clubhouse parking lot, the Texas sky had turned shades of orange and deep blue. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the lot while neighbors gathered outside in small groups, quietly exchanging opinions before the meeting even started. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with charcoal drifting from a nearby backyard barbecue, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that usually belonged to ordinary suburban life. Inside the clubhouse, however, the mood felt entirely different. Folding chairs filled the meeting room, fluorescent lights reflected off polished hardwood floors, and a projector displayed the homeowners association agenda on a large screen. Near the bottom of the list sat one item printed in bold letters: Private Gate Access Review. I took a seat near the back of the room without saying a word. Diane stood confidently at the front beside several board members, greeting residents with the practiced smile of someone convinced she already knew the outcome. A few minutes later, Deputy Scott Whitmore quietly entered through a side door, wearing his county uniform. He did not take a seat with the audience. Instead, he stood near the wall with his arms folded, observing the room without speaking. His presence alone created the impression that official authority supported everything the board intended to discuss. Diane eventually tapped the microphone. "Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. As many of you know, one unresolved issue continues affecting neighborhood emergency planning." Several residents immediately turned toward me. Diane continued with carefully chosen words. "One neighboring property owner has refused repeated requests to provide gate access that could benefit emergency responders and community safety." She never mentioned my name, yet everyone in the room understood exactly who she meant. A property map appeared on the projector screen, showing my ranch bordering the subdivision. Red lines highlighted roads, easements, and neighboring lots, while my entrance stood clearly marked near the center of the display. Diane explained how faster access might someday help emergency vehicles reach surrounding areas more efficiently. The presentation sounded reasonable until it quietly drifted from hypothetical concerns into assumptions about authority. When she finished, she asked whether anyone wished to comment. The room remained silent for several seconds before I stood. "May I ask one question?" Diane nodded politely. "Of course." I looked toward the projector before turning back to the audience. "Has any county agency issued a legal requirement stating that I must provide a key to privately owned property?" The room became noticeably quieter. Diane hesitated before answering. "The board believes cooperation serves everyone's best interests." I smiled slightly. "That was not my question." Scott finally spoke from the side of the room. "Sir, voluntary cooperation often prevents unnecessary disputes." I acknowledged him with a respectful nod. "I completely agree. Which is why I asked whether such a legal requirement exists." Neither of them answered directly. Instead, Diane thanked everyone for their comments and moved to the next agenda item with surprising speed. Around me, neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. Some lowered their printed agendas and quietly reread the documents in front of them. Others looked back toward the property map as though seeing it differently for the first time. By the time the meeting ended, nobody applauded. Conversations continued in small clusters throughout the parking lot, while Diane spoke privately with several board members near the entrance. I walked to my truck beneath the warm glow of the parking lot lights without speaking to anyone. Before driving away, I opened my phone and saved the official meeting agenda, downloaded the publicly posted presentation, and noted the exact time Scott chose to address the audience despite claiming no formal role in the discussion. As I pulled onto the quiet county road leading back toward my ranch, I realized something had changed. Diane believed she had convinced the neighborhood that I was the problem. Instead, she had unintentionally encouraged people to begin asking the one thing she had worked hardest to avoid. What actual authority did the homeowners association really have over a gate that had never belonged to them in the first place? Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air rolling across the pasture. Sunlight glimmered on the weathered brass lock while the familiar scent of cedar drifted from the front porch. I spent the first hour repairing an old section of fence, listening to the steady rhythm of a hammer striking nails and the distant sound of cattle moving across neighboring land. Outwardly, everything looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet places have a way of hiding complicated stories. Inside the ranch house, however, my dining room table looked more like an archive than a family gathering place. Stacks of neatly labeled binders stretched across one end. Each folder contained certified letters, neighborhood notices, property records, meeting agendas, photographs, and copies of every public statement Diane had made since this entire dispute began. Beside them sat several encrypted storage drives holding synchronized security recordings from cameras positioned around the entrance. Every file had already been organized by date, time, and location. Nothing depended on memory because memory changes. Documents do not. My laptop displayed a digital timeline covering nearly every interaction over the past several weeks. One column tracked written correspondence. Another matched surveillance footage. Another connected public neighborhood posts with specific visits to my property. As each new event occurred, another piece quietly locked into place. Looking at the screen reminded me of assembling a puzzle where every person insisting they were right unknowingly provided another missing piece. Around noon, my security monitor alerted me to movement near the entrance. This time it was not Diane or Scott. Two members of the Homeowners Association Architectural Committee stood outside the gate carrying clipboards and measuring wheels. They remained on the public side of the entrance but spent several minutes examining the fence line, taking notes, and pointing toward the lock. I watched from the porch without interrupting them. Eventually, one of them noticed the camera mounted beneath the gate canopy and offered an awkward wave before returning to the vehicle. The entire visit lasted less than 15 minutes. After they left, I saved the footage beside the previous recordings and added another entry to the timeline. That night, just after midnight, my phone vibrated. Camera 3. Signal lost. I sat upright before a second notification appeared almost immediately. Connection failed. By the time I reached the gate with a flashlight, one of the cameras was hanging crooked from its mount. The housing struck hard enough to crack the lens. The brass chain still swayed gently in the wind as if nothing had happened. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been opened. Someone simply wanted me to stop watching. Before sunrise, I replaced the damaged camera without saying a word. Then I installed two more. One where anyone looking could easily find it, and another where nobody would ever think to look. Later that afternoon, another certified envelope arrived. The newest letter informed me that the board intended to conduct what it described as a final review concerning access concerns affecting the surrounding community. Once again, the wording sounded confident while carefully avoiding any actual legal authority. I highlighted several passages before placing the document inside the growing binder. My father often said that people reveal their intentions most clearly when they believe nobody is paying close attention. As evening approached, I drove into town for supplies. At the local hardware store, I unexpectedly crossed paths with Scott. He stood near a display of outdoor lighting, pushing a shopping cart with ordinary household items inside. Without the uniform, he looked less like a deputy and more like any other neighbor finishing weekend errands. He noticed me almost immediately. "Nathan," he said with a polite nod. "Small town." "It usually is," I replied. For a moment, neither of us mentioned the gate. Then Scott lowered his voice. "This situation does not have to keep growing." I looked at him calmly. "Then it should stop growing." He sighed quietly. "Diane believes she is protecting the community." "Believing something does not automatically make it lawful," I answered. He considered that sentence for several seconds before giving a slight nod and pushing his cart toward another aisle. It was the shortest conversation we had shared, yet somehow it revealed more than any meeting had. Walking back to my truck beneath the warm Texas sunset, I realized something important. Scott no longer sounded certain. Diane still believed she was leading the board toward victory, but the people around her were beginning to recognize small cracks appearing beneath the confidence she worked so hard to project. By the time I reached my ranch that evening and heard the familiar metallic click of the gate closing behind me, I knew they were preparing one final attempt to force my hand. What they still did not understand was that every step they planned to take had already become part of a record they could no longer control. Monday morning arrived with a sky so clear it almost looked polished. Sunlight spilled across the gravel driveway, catching the faded green paint on my family gate and making the old brass lock shine against the weathered chain. The air carried the familiar scent of cedar mixed with freshly cut hay from a neighboring ranch, while a gentle breeze stirred the oak branches above the entrance. Everything outside suggested another peaceful day, but experience had taught me that quiet mornings often arrived just before people made their biggest mistakes. At exactly 8:42, my security monitor chimed. Diane's white sport utility vehicle rolled toward the gate, followed only seconds later by Scott's marked county patrol vehicle. Unlike their previous visits, neither of them hesitated. They parked side by side with the confidence of people who believed they had reached the final chapter of the conversation. I walked toward the entrance carrying nothing except my coffee mug. Diane greeted me with a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. "Good morning, Nathan." We are here to give you one final opportunity to resolve this voluntarily. She held up another folder containing freshly printed documents clipped neatly together. Scott stood quietly beside her, saying nothing at first, allowing Diane to control the discussion. I accepted the paperwork and slowly reviewed every page. The language had become noticeably stronger. The letter described the request as a final notice from the board concerning neighborhood access planning. Several paragraphs referred repeatedly to cooperation, responsibility, and community expectations. Yet despite the confident wording, the one thing still missing was the one thing that mattered most. There was still no court order, no county directive, no statute requiring me to surrender a key to privately owned property. I closed the folder and handed it back. "Thank you," I said calmly. "The answer remains the same." Diane exhaled slowly, clearly disappointed that the script she expected was no longer unfolding. "Nathan, I do not understand why you insist on making this so difficult." I looked toward the old gate before answering. Protecting private property is not difficult. Ignoring boundaries usually is. Scott finally stepped forward. His tone remained polite, but there was a new seriousness in his voice. "Sir, nobody wants unnecessary conflict." I nodded respectfully. "Neither do I." He glanced briefly toward the brass lock before speaking again. "Then perhaps you should reconsider." I met his eyes without raising my voice. "Deputy, may I ask you one question?" "Go ahead. Are you standing here today as a deputy sheriff carrying legal authority from the county, or are you standing here as the husband of the Homeowners Association president?" For the first time since this began, complete silence settled over the entrance. Even Diane looked toward Scott, waiting for his answer. He paused noticeably longer than I expected before replying. "Today I am here to support a community discussion." I gave a slight nod. "Thank you. That answers my question." Diane immediately attempted to regain control of the conversation. "This is becoming unnecessary." "Actually," I replied, "clarity is always necessary." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the chain gently tapping against the steel gate as the morning breeze passed through the entrance. As the silence stretched between us, Scott kept his eyes on the weathered brass lock instead of looking at me. Finally, he turned toward Diane. "I checked with dispatch this morning." She frowned, and he hesitated for a moment before answering. "No fire captain has ever requested a key to this gate." For the first time since this began, Diane answered almost too quickly. "They don't know what they'll need until an emergency happens." Scott didn't argue. He simply looked back at my gate one more time, his expression noticeably different from every previous visit. Then he quietly stepped away. That was the first real crack I had seen. Not in the steel gate, not in the brass lock, in the certainty they had shared since the day this dispute began. Scott finally adjusted his stance and looked toward Diane before quietly saying, "Maybe we should go." She stared at him in visible surprise, then turned back toward me. "This conversation is not over." I smiled politely. "I know." They returned to their vehicles and drove away without another word. I remained standing beside the gate long after the dust settled back onto the gravel road. Inside my jacket pocket, my phone vibrated once with a simple notification I had been expecting. Another piece of the timeline had just been confirmed. The notification wasn't from Diane or the Homeowners Association. It came through a secure application that almost nobody knew existed. The message contained only a single sentence: "Timeline threshold satisfied." No names, no explanations, just quiet confirmation that somewhere beyond Willow Creek, someone had finished reviewing everything I had patiently collected over the past several weeks. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself a slow, steady breath. The waiting was almost over. They still believed they were deciding how this story would end. What neither of them realized was that the ending had already begun, and the next time they arrived at my gate, they would finally discover who had really been asking the questions all along. Friday arrived beneath a cloudless Texas sky, and by mid-morning the warmth of the sun had already driven the scent of cedar and fresh-cut grass across the ranch. I stood on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching long shadows retreat from the gravel driveway, while the old brass chain hanging across my family gate reflected flashes of golden light. The entire property felt unusually still, almost as though it understood something important was about to happen. At exactly 9:14, my security monitor displayed two familiar vehicles approaching the entrance. Diane's white sport utility vehicle stopped first. Scott's marked patrol vehicle rolled in behind her a few seconds later. Neither of them appeared rushed. They stepped out carrying the same confidence they had displayed since the first day this dispute began. Diane held another neatly organized folder beneath her arm, while Scott walked beside her with calm professionalism. I met them at the gate before either of them spoke. Diane smiled politely. "Nathan, we are here to make one final request before the board considers additional options." I nodded. I assumed today would be important. She held out the folder. "These are revised documents reflecting the board's latest decision." I accepted the papers and slowly examined every page. New signatures had been added. Additional references to emergency preparedness appeared throughout the letter. The formatting looked cleaner than previous notices. Even so, the central problem remained unchanged. There was still no judicial order, no county directive, and no legal authority requiring me to surrender a key to privately owned land. I returned the folder to Diane without changing my expression. "The answer remains no." She looked disappointed but not surprised. "Then we have reached the end of voluntary cooperation." Scott stepped forward slightly. His tone remained respectful. "Nathan, I hope you understand this situation has become much larger than simply one gate." I looked directly at him. "You are right. It became much larger several days ago." Diane frowned as though trying to understand what I meant. Before either of them could continue, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Diane's eyes immediately focused on my hand, clearly expecting me to remove the brass gate key she had been pursuing for weeks. Instead, I unfolded a dark leather credential wallet. The gold badge inside reflected the morning sunlight for only a brief moment before I closed it again. Scott stared silently. Diane blinked twice without saying a word. "What exactly was that?" she finally asked. I slipped the credential back into my pocket before answering calmly. "The question you should have asked much earlier." Then I removed my phone and selected a single secure contact. The call connected almost immediately. "This is Brooks," I said. "The documented sequence is complete. You are clear to proceed." I ended the call without another word. For several seconds, nothing happened. The breeze gently rattled the familiar chain against the steel gate while birds circled above the pasture. Then the low sound of approaching engines drifted across the county road. 3 dark sport utility vehicles rounded the bend, followed by 2 unmarked sedans, each parking with quiet precision behind Diane and Scott. Men and women wearing plain business attire stepped out carrying identification wallets and document cases rather than urgency. The lead investigator approached with measured confidence before offering me a brief nod. I returned the greeting and handed him a sealed evidence drive from my jacket. Diane looked from me to the arriving officials, then back toward Scott, whose expression had changed completely. The certainty he carried every previous visit had quietly disappeared. The lead investigator introduced himself professionally before displaying federal credentials to both of them. No voices were raised. No dramatic commands filled the air. Calm professionalism replaced confident assumptions within a matter of seconds. Diane slowly lowered the folder she had carried so proudly. Scott remained silent beside her, studying the identification presented before him. I looked toward the weathered brass lock hanging from my family's gate and remembered something my father used to tell me. The strongest doors are not protected by heavier locks. They are protected by people willing to wait until the truth arrives. Standing there beneath the warm Texas sun, watching every carefully documented piece finally fall into place, I realized Diane and Scott had never actually been trying to unlock my gate. They had unknowingly unlocked the final chapter of an investigation they never realized had been surrounding them from the very beginning. The lead investigator introduced himself with calm professionalism, speaking in the measured tone of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. The warm Texas breeze continued moving through the cedar trees while the brass chain on my family gate gently tapped against the weathered steel post. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. Diane stared at the federal credentials as though she expected them to disappear if she looked away long enough. Scott's attention shifted between the badge, the arriving investigators, and the evidence drive I had just handed over. The confidence that had accompanied every previous visit quietly gave way to uncertainty. The lead investigator thanked me for my cooperation before turning toward Diane and Scott. "We appreciate your patience. We have several questions regarding documented interactions that have occurred over the past few weeks. Diane looked visibly confused. This is about a neighborhood gate. The investigator answered calmly. The gate helped establish a timeline. That single sentence seemed to leave her searching for words. I unlocked the chain and slowly opened the gate, not because the homeowners association had requested it, but because the investigative team had already coordinated lawful access. The familiar hinges released their deep metallic sound as the entrance swung inward, revealing the long gravel driveway leading toward my Cedar Ranch house. Inside, the dining room had been carefully prepared long before that morning. One end of the large wooden table held neatly organized binders labeled by date. Beside them sat property surveys, certified correspondence, meeting agendas, archived neighborhood posts, security footage indexes, digital storage drives, and printed timelines connecting every interaction from beginning to end. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer paper, and cedar from the original walls my father had restored years earlier. Several investigators quietly reviewed the material with remarkable efficiency. One compared timestamps from surveillance recordings against certified mail receipts. Another matched public statements with meeting minutes downloaded from the Homeowners Association website. A third carefully reviewed copies of neighborhood maps Diane had presented during the board meeting. Every document connected naturally to another. Every conversation aligned with recorded footage. Nothing depended upon assumptions because every important event had already been preserved. Scott stood near the doorway watching one investigator examine the notices he had personally delivered. His expression remained calm, yet thoughtful, as though he had finally begun seeing the complete sequence instead of isolated moments. Diane slowly walked around the table, studying the organized binders. "You kept all of this?" she asked quietly. I nodded. Every letter, every visit, every conversation that took place on my property. She looked toward the security monitor displaying synchronized recordings from multiple cameras overlooking the entrance. "You expected this." I shook my head gently. I expected people to make their own decisions. I simply documented them. Outside, additional investigators arrived at the Willow Creek Clubhouse after coordinating with local officials responsible for community records. Residents gathered along sidewalks beneath large oak trees, quietly watching unfamiliar vehicles park outside the administrative office. Nobody shouted. Nobody celebrated. Curious conversations replaced neighborhood rumors as people slowly realized the situation had always involved more than a disagreement over one locked gate. Mrs. Henderson stood near the entrance holding her golden retriever while observing the activity from a respectful distance. When our eyes met, she offered a small nod that required no explanation. By late afternoon, labeled evidence boxes moved carefully between vehicles while investigators continued verifying records with deliberate patience. Looking across the ranch toward the weathered green gate, standing exactly where it had stood for generations, I understood something my grandfather once told my father and my father eventually told me. Boundaries only matter when someone chooses to test them. The gate itself had never created this story. It simply became the place where every choice, every assumption, and every carefully documented fact finally met the truth at exactly the same moment. By the following week, Willow Creek Estates no longer sounded like a neighborhood built on quiet assumptions. It sounded like a community finally asking careful questions. The familiar streets still curved past neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes, but conversations had changed. Instead of repeating rumors, neighbors gathered in small groups comparing facts they had personally witnessed. The warm Texas sun reflected from the clubhouse windows while the scent of freshly mowed grass drifted through the afternoon air. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks as though nothing unusual had happened, yet every adult seemed to glance toward the administrative building before continuing with their day. I stopped by the local feed store that Tuesday morning to pick up supplies for the ranch, and before I even reached the checkout counter, several neighbors greeted me with noticeably different expressions. Weeks earlier, they had looked at me with quiet suspicion. Now they simply nodded with respectful curiosity. Nobody asked detailed questions because everyone understood there were things that could not be discussed. Instead, they spoke about ordinary life, about the weather, about cattle prices, and about the upcoming county fair. Somehow those simple conversations felt more meaningful than all the arguments that had filled the previous month. Later that afternoon, I drove past the Willow Creek Clubhouse on my way home. The parking lot held only a handful of vehicles, and a temporary notice had replaced the colorful community announcements normally displayed near the entrance. Board meetings had been postponed pending administrative review, and future communications would be handled through interim management. The notice contained no dramatic language, only simple facts presented with quiet professionalism. That alone told me how much had changed. People who once relied on confident declarations had been replaced by people willing to verify information before speaking. Back at the ranch, I walked toward the old gate carrying a small toolbox to tighten one loose hinge that had started squeaking during the previous week. The weathered green paint still showed tiny chips left by decades of Texas summers, and the brass lock carried the same worn finish my father had polished countless times. As I worked, Mrs. Henderson approached from the public road with her golden retriever walking calmly beside her. She smiled warmly before stopping near the entrance. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not because of what happened afterward, but because you never stopped treating people with respect even when they misunderstood you." I rested my wrench on the fence rail and smiled. Respect is easier to keep than to rebuild. She looked toward the neighborhood before speaking again. Many of us believed confidence meant someone was right. Now we know confidence and authority are not always the same thing. I nodded quietly. Facts eventually separate the two. After she continued her evening walk, I finished adjusting the hinge and stepped back to admire the gate. It looked exactly as it always had. The difference was not the gate. The difference was how people now understood the meaning behind it. Boundaries were no longer viewed as obstacles. They were recognized as responsibilities. Inside the ranch house, the binders remained neatly organized on the dining room shelves, their purpose finally complete. They were no longer preparation for what might happen. They had become a permanent record of what had happened. As the sun settled behind the oak trees, casting long golden shadows across the gravel driveway, I slipped the familiar brass key into the lock, turned it slowly, and listened to the soft metallic click echo through the quiet evening. That simple sound reminded me that truth rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one conversation, one document, one patient decision at a time until the entire picture becomes impossible to ignore. Looking down the empty county road stretching beyond my gate, I realized the story had never been about winning an argument. It had always been about allowing the truth enough time to stand on its own. Several months passed before anyone in Willow Creek mentioned the old gate again, and by then the conversations sounded completely different. The neighborhood still woke beneath the same wide Texas sky. Sprinklers still clicked across carefully maintained lawns before sunrise, and the scent of fresh-cut grass still drifted through the warm morning air. Yet something invisible had changed. People no longer assumed confidence meant authority. They had learned to ask questions before accepting answers. My own routine settled back into the quiet rhythm I had always loved. Every morning, I walked the fence line with a mug of fresh coffee in my hand, listened to meadowlarks singing from the cedar posts, and watched sunlight spread slowly across the pasture where my horses grazed without a care in the world. The weathered green gate remained exactly where my grandfather had built it decades earlier, standing between the county road and the ranch with the same brass chain and the same worn lock that had protected our family through 3 generations. One afternoon, I opened the drawer beside my desk and looked at the thick binders that had occupied so much of my life during those difficult weeks. Every certified letter remained filed in chronological order. Every security recording still carried its original timestamp. Every public statement still matched the corresponding notes and documents. I closed the drawer with a quiet sense of gratitude, not because I enjoyed preserving conflict, but because careful preparation had allowed the truth to speak without anyone needing to raise their voice. Later that evening, Mrs. Henderson stopped by once more with her golden retriever happily walking beside her. She smiled toward the entrance before looking back at me. "You know," she said, "I used to think that gate represented stubbornness." I followed her eyes toward the familiar brass lock glowing softly beneath the setting sun. "And now?" I asked. She smiled. "Now I think it represents responsibility." I nodded because she understood something many people spend years learning. Boundaries are not walls built to keep good people away. They are promises to protect what has been entrusted to you. After she continued down the quiet county road, I walked slowly toward the entrance one final time before sunset. The gravel crunched beneath my boots exactly as it had when I was a boy following my father through the ranch. I slipped the old brass key into the lock, turned it gently, opened the gate just wide enough to drive my truck through, then stepped back out and secured it once more. The familiar metallic click echoed across the pasture before disappearing into the evening breeze. That sound carried more memories than words ever could. It reminded me that the gate had never needed defending through anger, only through patience. It reminded me that authority borrowed from titles or assumptions eventually fades, while integrity built through truth quietly endures. Most of all, it reminded me that justice rarely arrives in dramatic moments. It arrives through ordinary people making careful decisions, preserving honest records, respecting lawful boundaries, and allowing facts to outlast opinions. I looked down the empty road stretching beyond my property as the last golden light settled across the cedar trees, then turned back toward the ranch that had always been my home. The gate remained closed, the key remained where it belonged, and peace returned not because someone finally surrendered, but because the truth had been given enough time to stand completely on its own. My grandfather was right all those years ago. The strongest lock is never the one hanging on the gate. It is the quiet conviction to protect what is right without ever forgetting that real justice is patient, thoughtful, and ultimately impossible to stop.